In the mid-18th century, when Britain ruled the oceans and the Royal Navy stood as the unchallenged guardian of empire, one name echoed across every shipyard, tavern, and port: HMS Royal George. She was not merely a vessel of war, but a symbol of British mastery, a floating fortress destined to carry the nation's pride upon the world's seas. Her story began not in fire or fury, but in the pounding rhythm of hammers and the scent of fresh-cut oak. It was 1746 at the great shipyards of Woolwich Dockyard, along the banks of the River Thames. Britain was embroiled in constant rivalry with France and Spain, and the Admiralty demanded ships that could dominate any battle. Out of this demand came an ambitious project: the construction of a 100-gun first-rate ship of the line, the largest and most powerful of her age. The Royal George was to be a masterpiece of naval engineering. Her hull was to be built from over 2,000 oak trees, her masts towering high enough to be seen from miles away. She would carry 3 full gun decks, each bristling with cannons of iron and brass, instruments of thunder that would make the very seas tremble. As she took shape, thousands came to watch. Her keel stretched across the dock like the backbone of a sleeping giant. Carpenters, rope makers, and shipwrights worked day and night, their hands crafting each curve, each plank, each joint with reverent precision. When the time finally came to launch her, crowds lined the Thames, cheering as this behemoth of wood and iron slid gracefully into the water. The Royal George was not just another warship. She was the crown jewel of the fleet, the embodiment of Britain's naval glory. Her decks were lined with polished cannons, her sails of the finest canvas, her figurehead, a majestic carving of King George II, gazing proudly over the seas. Inside, she was a world unto herself. Gun decks stretching into darkness, storerooms packed with barrels of powder and food, cabins fit for admirals, and a crew's quarters that smelled of tar, rope, and salt. When she first set sail, she was the pride of the Royal Navy. The sound of her guns during sea trials was said to echo like the roar of the heavens. Every sailor dreamed of serving aboard her. For years, she carried Britain's banner into wars, blockades, and triumphs. She fought in the 7 Years' War, and her guns thundered in the Battle of Quiberon Bay, a victory that secured Britain's naval supremacy over France. But time, as it always does, began to take its toll. By the 1780s, the Royal George was no longer the shining beauty she once had been. Her timbers creaked, her decks bore scars of countless voyages, and her hull needed frequent repairs. Yet, she still commanded immense respect. She had become a living legend, a veteran of sea battles and royal processions alike. To the British public, she was untouchable. Unsinkable, they said, as eternal as the empire itself. In August 1782, the Royal George lay anchored at Spithead near Portsmouth. Though aged, she was being readied for one last mission, to sail to Gibraltar as part of a major fleet, carrying supplies and reinforcements to the British garrison. But before she could depart, she needed final repairs and resupply. Small issues, the kind that seemed trivial at the time, needed attention: leaking casks, damaged planks near the waterline, and adjustments to her lower gun ports. These were routine tasks, the sort of maintenance carried out hundreds of times before on hundreds of ships. No one, not her captain, not her admirals, not even the shipwrights, could have imagined that such routine work would soon turn into one of the most horrifying naval disasters in British history. That August, the weather was kind. The sea at Spithead was calm, reflecting the masts and rigging like a mirror. The wind was gentle, carrying the faint sound of sailors singing as they worked. On board, preparations were in full swing. Supplies were being loaded, barrels rolled across the deck, and boats ferried goods from shore. Children of dock workers played on the lower deck while women sold fruits, trinkets, and baked pies to the sailors. The crew was relaxed. After all, they were still in home waters. Some wrote letters, others shared jokes or carved small keepsakes from scrap wood. The Admiral of the Blue, Sir Richard Kempenfelt, was also aboard. He was one of Britain's most brilliant naval minds, calm, intelligent, and deeply respected by his men. Though in his 60s, he still commanded with the sharpness of a younger man. On that morning, he sat in his cabin, writing dispatches to the Admiralty, utterly unaware that these would be his last words to the world. The ship's carpenter and his team were busy at work, checking for leaks along the port side. To reach the damaged area, the ship had to be heeled over slightly, tilted so that one side sat lower in the water. This was standard procedure. But that tilt, combined with the open gun ports and the extra weight being loaded, would soon spell doom. Still, no one suspected danger. To the men and women aboard, the Royal George stood as solid as the cliffs of Dover. A few cautious officers commented that the ship seemed to lean more than usual, but their words were lost amid the noise of hammers, laughter, and gulls. At that moment, Britain's most powerful warship, the pride of the Empire, was unknowingly poised on the edge of catastrophe. By noon, the ship would be gone, and with her, over 900 souls would vanish beneath the calm waters of Spithead. But on that serene morning, no one could have guessed that history was quietly holding its breath. The Royal George, once the mightiest vessel afloat, stood proud and silent, her flags rippling gently in the breeze, her cannons glinting in the sunlight, completely unaware that within a few short hours she would become Britain's greatest naval tomb. By the mid-18th century, the British Empire was the most formidable naval power on Earth, and at the heart of that dominance stood the HMS Royal George. She was not just another ship in the Royal Navy's arsenal. She was its shining crown jewel, a floating fortress of oak and iron that symbolized Britain's maritime supremacy. When she was launched in 1756 at Woolwich Dockyard, the world took notice. The Royal George was a first-rate ship of the line, boasting more than 100 cannons, and a crew complement exceeding 800 men when fully armed for war. Her towering masts and gilded stern carvings announced her presence long before her cannons thundered. To sailors, the Royal George was a legend in her own right, the kind of vessel that inspired awe in every man who served aboard her. She had fought valiantly during the 7 Years' War and had become a floating embodiment of British might. Wherever she sailed, the British flag seemed to flutter a little prouder, a little higher. The public adored her. Paintings, songs, and poems celebrated her victories. She was known as the pride of the Royal Navy. But beneath the shining veneer of glory, there lingered an unsettling truth, one that time would eventually expose. Ships of her size and age required constant maintenance. Wooden warships, for all their grandeur, were fragile giants, endlessly at war with the elements. Salt water corroded their timbers, storms strained their joints, shipworms gnawed unseen holes beneath the waves, and after decades at sea, even a ship as mighty as the Royal George began to show her age. By 1782, she was stationed at Spithead, off Portsmouth, preparing for a long-awaited mission. The British fleet was to sail soon, commanded by the esteemed Admiral Richard Kempenfelt, a brilliant tactician and deeply respected officer. The Royal George was being readied for action once more, stocked with supplies, gunpowder, and hundreds of sailors who had come aboard to serve their country. Among them were not just hardened seamen, but also shipwrights, dock workers, and women, wives, mothers, and merchants who had boarded temporarily to sell goods, visit loved ones, or simply see them off. In those days, it was common for civilians to be aboard ships anchored in harbor. The decks of the Royal George were alive with laughter, trade, and conversation. Children played among barrels and rope coils, while officers discussed orders under the bright summer sun of August 28, 1782. No one knew that this would be the last day of the Royal George's life, or that the calm harbor around her would soon turn into a watery grave for more than 900 souls. That morning, shipwrights had begun an urgent repair operation. The Royal George had a fault in her hull, specifically near one of her lower gun ports. To access it, the crew had to perform a delicate balancing act, literally. They tilted the ship, or heeled her over, to expose part of the hull below the waterline. This was a common procedure for ships of her kind, but one that carried enormous risk. Too much tilt, and water could rush into the lower gun ports. As the day wore on, the sun glinted off the water, and the ship leaned slightly to port. It didn't seem alarming. Officers continued their duties. Civilians came and went on small boats. Below deck, sailors worked tirelessly to shift heavy barrels of rum, water, and gunpowder to counterbalance the heel. Each movement of cargo, though, added unseen pressure. Admiral Kempenfelt remained in his cabin, reviewing naval papers, unaware that the very ship beneath him was balancing on a knife's edge. On deck, Captain Waghorn and his officers debated the repair progress. Some noticed that the ship seemed to be listing more than usual, but the gentle rocking of the harbor made it difficult to judge. The bosun's mates shouted commands, ropes strained, the carpenters worked in rhythm with the creaking of the hull. For a moment, everything appeared normal, the calm before the catastrophe. But deep below, where the ship's wooden belly met the sea, disaster was silently brewing. The Royal George was carrying over 100 tons of water and stores, and with the tilt, the open gun ports had dipped dangerously close to the waves. A few sailors muttered that they could hear sloshing where it shouldn't be. Someone joked nervously that she's drinking more than her crew today. But no one truly grasped the danger. The truth was that the ship's structure was too old, her timbers weakened by years of service. She was a giant held together by tradition and faith in her name, more than by the strength of her aging oak. As the tide shifted and the ship heeled slightly further, water began trickling into the open ports. Not a rush, not yet, but a whispering seep. A few buckets were filled to scoop it out. "Just a bit of seepage," someone said. "She'll right herself when we finish the job." But she didn't. By afternoon, a light breeze swept across Spithead. The Royal George listed a few degrees more. Then, without warning, the shift became sudden, violent. Barrels rolled, crates smashed against bulkheads. The shouts of sailors pierced the air. "Close the ports! Close the ports!" someone screamed. But it was too late. The sea surged through the open mouths of the lower gun ports like a predator unleashed. Within moments, the mighty ship that had once ruled oceans began to die. Slowly, inexorably, before the eyes of hundreds. What had begun as a routine repair had turned into one of Britain's greatest naval tragedies in a matter of minutes. Families, sailors, and officers alike were now trapped aboard a sinking colossus, unaware that help would come too late. The morning calm over Spithead was deceptive. The air was clear, the water gently rippled under the sunlight, and the Royal George floated peacefully at anchor, a titan of the sea, her white sails furled, her proud flag snapping lazily in the breeze. On board, laughter mingled with the hammering of shipwrights. The deck bustled with life, sailors working the ropes, officers pacing, women selling fruit and trinkets, and children darting between barrels. But deep inside the ship's hull, a creeping danger was gathering strength. The heel of the ship, that subtle lean to port, had increased by another few degrees. Most dismissed it. She was a massive warship, after all. What could possibly happen in the calm safety of a home harbor? Shortly after noon, the first real warning signs began to show. Below decks, sailors moving casks of rum noticed that the floor was slick with seawater. Buckets were called for. Laughter turned to uneasy murmurs. And someone shouted up to the deck that the water is coming in faster than it should. The officer of the watch frowned but didn't sound the alarm. Ships often took in a little water during such maintenance. A few men were sent below to investigate. And that decision, innocent as it seemed, cost them their lives. The repair work continued. The shipwrights below were busy inspecting the copper sheathing on the hull, hammering and patching. The rhythmic clangs of metal on wood echoed through the lower decks. Then, silence. For a split second, no one could tell why. Then came the shout, "She's over too far! The gun ports are under!" It happened almost instantly. The water that had been trickling in turned into a roaring surge. The sea, calm and silent moments ago, exploded through the open gun ports like a living thing, powerful, cold, merciless. Barrels, tools, and bodies were thrown against bulkheads. The lights went out. The ship groaned, the sound of timber bending and breaking under sudden weight. Above deck, chaos erupted. Passengers screamed as the world beneath them tilted sharply. Dishes, muskets, and crates slid across the deck, crashing into men and overboard. The crew shouted orders, "Right the ship! Man the pumps! Close the ports!" But the words were lost in the pandemonium. The Royal George began to list heavily, her port side sinking into the sea. From the shore, onlookers saw it. At first disbelief, then horror. A ship so vast, so mighty, leaning at an impossible angle. Admiral Kempenfelt was still in his cabin, poring over dispatches. When the shock came, his papers flew into the air. He tried to rush to the upper deck, but the ship lurched violently. In seconds, the corridor became a steep slope. Men grabbed for anything they could: beams, door frames, ropes. The roar of rushing water was deafening now. In the lower decks, sailors and civilians were trapped as the icy flood poured in. Some clawed at hatches, others fought to reach ladders that now hung almost vertically. Mothers screamed for their children. The ship's carpenter, realizing the scale of disaster, ran toward the gun deck shouting, "She's going! God help us, she's going under!" Within 2 minutes, the ship had heeled so far that her starboard guns pointed skyward. The masts groaned, sails flapping wildly as rigging snapped. The sound of splintering wood filled the air, mingling with human cries. Then, in one catastrophic moment, the Royal George rolled completely onto her side. Water rushed across the deck, sweeping men and women into the sea. Small boats nearby tried desperately to reach the stricken vessel, their crews shouting and rowing furiously. But the suction of the sinking giant made it nearly impossible to get close. Witnesses from nearby ships later described the scene as surreal. A mountain of wood and iron slowly swallowing itself. They could hear the muffled screams from inside the hull even as it disappeared beneath the surface. Admiral Kempenfelt was among those lost. Trapped in his cabin, he was said to have made no attempt to flee, accepting his fate with stoic calm. Dozens of officers and hundreds of sailors followed him to the depths. Some leapt into the sea at the last moment, clinging to floating debris. Others were dragged down as the ship's vast mass plunged below. It took less than 5 minutes for the Royal George to capsize completely. In that brief window, a ship carrying over 1,200 people, sailors, workers, merchants, women, and children, turned into a watery tomb. When the last of her masts slipped beneath the waves, a terrible silence settled over Spithead. The water boiled with debris, barrels, planks, splintered timbers, and survivors gasping for air. Some clung to wreckage, calling out names that would never answer back. Nearby ships lowered boats immediately. Sailors dived into the water, hauling out the half-drowned and the injured. But for hundreds, there was no rescue to come. The cold, murky sea of the English Channel had claimed them. By the time the rescue effort began in earnest, the Royal George was gone. Lying on her side on the seabed, her flag still fluttering faintly in the current. The harbor that had always been a place of pride and departure had become a scene of national mourning. When the final count was made, it was said that over 900 lives were lost. Sailors, civilians, women, and children, making it one of the deadliest naval disasters in British history. The unthinkable had happened. Britain's greatest ship had not fallen to an enemy fleet, nor to storm or cannon fire, but to the quiet negligence of man and the unyielding weight of the sea. As the evening sun dipped below the horizon that day, survivors on the shore watched the gentle ripples where the Royal George had once stood tall. The laughter and music of the morning were gone, replaced by the eerie stillness of tragedy. And beneath that still surface, in the dark waters of Spithead, the pride of the Royal Navy, and the souls of hundreds, rested in silence. On the calm morning of August 29, 1782, the HMS Royal George lay anchored at Spithead, near Portsmouth, England. The sea was gentle, the sun warm, and the mood on deck surprisingly light. Sailors moved briskly about, performing routine duties. Families of the crew were allowed aboard, visiting loved ones before the ship would soon depart to join Admiral Howe's fleet for Gibraltar. Merchants and traders too had come, selling goods, fruit, bread, and ale, creating an atmosphere more festive than fearful. But beneath this calm surface, a deadly mistake was brewing. The Royal George, a massive first-rate ship of the line, was undergoing a simple maintenance task. The crew had been ordered to heel the ship, to tilt her slightly to one side, so repairs could be made to a leaky water pipe below the waterline. To do this, they shifted heavy guns and equipment to the port side. The maneuver was routine, something they had done before. But this time, something went terribly wrong. As the ship tilted, water began to pour through the open gun ports. Sailors noticed the water rising but assumed it was temporary, just part of the process. No alarms were raised. On deck, laughter continued, children played, and women chatted, unaware that disaster was minutes away. Down below, some officers realized that the angle was becoming too steep. They shouted for the crew to right the ship. Orders were given to shift the guns back to balance her, but it was too late. The Royal George groaned, a deep, haunting sound of timbers straining under impossible pressure. The ship had taken on too much water and the balance was gone. Within moments, the list grew sharper. Dishes and barrels rolled violently across the deck. Panic erupted. Shouts of, "She's going over!" echoed through the air. Witnesses from nearby ships watched in horror as the Royal George began to roll onto her side. Sailors and visitors clung to anything they could, rigging, masts, even each other, as the sea rushed over the deck. Within just 2 minutes, the mighty vessel completely capsized, her massive hull vanishing beneath the surface. Hundreds of men, women, and children were thrown into the water. The calm sea turned chaotic, filled with splintered wood, floating barrels, and desperate cries for help. Those who couldn't swim were dragged under by their heavy clothes. Some tried clinging to debris, others to each other, but the cold water was merciless. Among those lost was Rear Admiral Richard Kempenfelt, one of Britain's most respected officers. He had been writing in his cabin when the ship began to sink. Trapped below deck, he never stood a chance. In less than 5 minutes, the pride of the Royal Navy was gone, a ship of 100 guns and over 800 souls swallowed by the waters of Spithead. From nearby boats and ships, rescue efforts began instantly, but the chaos was overwhelming. Only around 230 people survived. For many, their final moments were silent, claimed by the sea that had once carried their hopes and pride. The Royal George disaster wasn't just a naval tragedy, it was a human one. Fathers, sons, wives, and children all perished in what should have been an ordinary morning at sea. And as the water settled, only a few bubbles and broken timbers marked the place where Britain's grand warship had slipped beneath the waves. The news of the HMS Royal George's sinking spread through England like wildfire. Within hours, small boats brought the first survivors to Portsmouth Harbor, men trembling from shock, shivering under soaked uniforms, eyes empty from what they had seen. Behind them floated wreckage, barrels, planks, the remains of small boats, and the lifeless bodies of those who had not been so fortunate. By evening, the coastline was filled with grief-stricken families waiting for word. Mothers clutched their children, wives scanned the horizon, and officers searched for comrades who would never return. But most of them would receive no closure. The Royal George had gone down so swiftly that over 900 souls were trapped within her hull, entombed in the dark waters of Spithead. The scale of the tragedy was unprecedented in peacetime. Even the mighty Royal Navy, accustomed to loss in battle, was shaken to its core. Newspapers across Britain carried the devastating headline, "Britain's Pride Lost. The Royal George sinks with 900 aboard." Public sorrow quickly turned to outrage and disbelief. How could the most powerful navy in the world allow such a catastrophe during routine maintenance? Rumors and theories began to swirl. Some claimed negligence. Others whispered about rotten timbers or design flaws. Ordinary citizens demanded accountability. In Portsmouth, funerals began almost immediately. Bodies that washed ashore were laid out in makeshift morgues. Coffins lined the churchyards, and the sound of mourning bells echoed for days. Sailors from nearby ships volunteered to help recover the dead, but many wept as they worked, recognizing the faces of friends and crewmates beneath the waves. Among the dead was Rear Admiral Richard Kempenfelt, whose death struck a deep national chord. He had been not just a naval hero, but a respected reformer, a man who had pushed for better conditions for sailors and more discipline within the fleet. When word spread that he had gone down with his ship, unable to escape his cabin, Britain mourned not only the loss of a ship, but of a leader. The king himself, George III, reportedly expressed deep sorrow upon hearing the news. Parliament observed a moment of silence. And across the empire, from London to distant colonies, the sinking of the Royal George became a grim reminder that even the mightiest vessels could fall victim to human error and fate. Artists, poets, and writers captured the tragedy in verse and painting. The most famous tribute came from poet William Cowper, whose haunting lines immortalized the sorrow of that day. "Toll for the brave that are no more, all sunk beneath the wave, fast by their native shore." His words echoed across the nation, a lament for the sailors, for their families, and for Britain's fragile pride at sea. In the weeks that followed, divers began to explore the wreck, a difficult and dangerous task in the murky waters of the Solent. They recovered cannonballs, ropes, and personal belongings, a child's shoe, a gold locket, a half-written letter. Each artifact told a silent story of life abruptly ended. But even as the physical remnants were brought to light, the emotional scars ran deep. The Royal George had not been lost to enemy fire or storm, but to a chain of small, preventable errors, a fact that haunted naval commanders for decades. Portsmouth, once bustling with optimism before the ship's departure, was now draped in sorrow. The harbor that had seen countless ships leave for war had witnessed one of the worst maritime disasters in British history. And as the tide rolled in and out over the sunken hull, It carried whispers of the men, women, and children who had vanished with her. A nation as pride turned to a nation as grief. As the HMS Royal George began to tilt dangerously to one side, life aboard shifted from routine to chaos in mere moments. The great warship, once a symbol of Britain's might, suddenly became a death trap for over 1,000 souls. Below deck, the gun ports that had been opened for maintenance now acted as gaping mouths for the sea. Water rushed in with terrifying speed, flooding the lower decks where carpenters, gunners, and sailors worked just moments before. The creaking of the ship's massive wooden frame mixed with the echoing roar of seawater and the desperate shouts of men trying to escape. Many sailors, realizing the ship was going down, tried to scramble up the ladders to the upper decks. But the narrow passageways quickly became blocked by panicked men, equipment, and barrels tumbling as the deck tilted further. Some clung to ropes, praying the ship would right itself as she had many times before. Others broke down in disbelief. The Royal George couldn't sink. Could it? Above, the scene was no less horrifying. Officers screamed for order, commanding men to cut free the ship's boats and save the women and children aboard. Among the chaos were sailors, wives and children who had come to visit before the ship's next deployment. Their cries pierced through the thunderous crash of collapsing timbers and falling cannons. The massive guns, weighing several tons each, tore loose from their mounts as the ship listed. They slid across the deck, crushing everything and everyone in their path. In a cruel twist of fate, the very weapons that symbolized Britain's power now became instruments of death. Outside, nearby ships realized something terrible was happening. Small boats were launched immediately as the Royal George leaned at an impossible angle. Within minutes, the proud flagship began to roll completely onto her side. Men leapt into the water, fighting to stay afloat amidst the wreckage, timber, and bodies. Eyewitnesses later described the sight as a monstrous wall of wood folding into the sea. In less than 7 minutes, the Royal George had vanished beneath the calm surface of Spithead. Only the desperate cries of survivors and the eerie bubbling of air from the sinking ship remained. When the waters finally stilled, the realization hit like a hammer. Britain's grandest ship was gone, and with her, nearly 900 lives. It wasn't just a maritime accident, it was a national tragedy. The sea had claimed one of the Royal Navy's finest, and no one could yet explain how something so powerful, so seemingly indestructible, could vanish so quickly. The question lingered in every sailor's mind. Was it human error? Or something far more sinister beneath the surface? When the thunderous roar of the sea finally settled, Portsmouth was no longer the same. The sun rose on a harbor that had once been proud, alive, and echoing with laughter. Now it stood silent, draped in mourning. The loss of the HMS Royal George had not just destroyed a ship. It had shattered families, shaken the Royal Navy, and left a deep scar on Britain's maritime soul. Word of the disaster spread like wildfire across the country. Newspapers called it Britain's greatest naval calamity. Over 900 souls were lost, including women, children, sailors, and officers. Many of them never had a chance to escape. Their bodies lay trapped within the shattered timbers of the mighty warship beneath the waves of Spithead. Grieving families gathered along the coast, staring endlessly at the waters that had swallowed their loved ones. Mothers wept, sailors prayed, and the sound of sobbing filled the taverns that once echoed with sea shanties. For days, small boats drifted through the wreckage, collecting the floating bodies that the tide reluctantly released. It was a grim, heartbreaking sight, faces pale and lifeless, uniforms torn, some still clutching each other in a final embrace. The public wanted answers. How could the pride of the Royal Navy simply vanish in calm weather? Rumors swirled. Was it sabotage? Negligence? Poor maintenance? The Admiralty launched an immediate investigation, led by Admiral Kempenfeldt's surviving officers and shipwrights who had once worked on the vessel. Eyewitness accounts painted a chilling picture. The ship had been undergoing repairs and was heeled over to one side to expose the hull for maintenance. But the ballast and gun placements had been mishandled. Too much weight on one side, and when the port side gun ports were opened to move supplies, the sea rushed in. Within a few heartbeats, the ship listed fatally, and the Royal George capsized, dragging everyone aboard down with it. But the investigation did not satisfy the grieving public. Many blamed the dockyard officers for carelessness. Others pointed fingers at Admiral Kempenfeldt, though most saw him as a hero who had gone down with honor. Sailors' families claimed warnings had been ignored, that workers knew the ship was unstable but had been pressured to hurry repairs. In the weeks that followed, the king himself was informed. Even George III expressed grief and outrage at the tragedy. Funerals were held across England, with mass burials near the coast. Poets wrote verses about the disaster. Artists painted haunting depictions of the ship sinking in broad daylight. Yet amid all this, the Royal Navy continued to sail. War was still looming, and the sea showed no mercy. For many, there was little time to mourn properly. Life had to go on. But beneath the waves, the wreck of the Royal George lay undisturbed, its cannons silent, its decks now home to the currents and the fish. Years later, divers would descend into the depths and bring up relics, timbers, guns, even personal belongings. Each discovery rekindled old memories and reopened wounds that had never truly healed. The sinking of the HMS Royal George became a symbol of both human error and human sacrifice, a haunting reminder that even the mightiest of ships, and the proudest of nations, can be humbled by the sea. As decades passed, the wreck of HMS Royal George became a ghostly legend beneath the waters of Spithead, a graveyard of oak and iron wrapped in silence. Yet, it wasn't forgotten. The tragedy had left behind not only grief, but also curiosity. What truly lay beneath those cold, murky depths? Could anything be salvaged from the pride of Britain's navy? The first major attempt to recover the ship's remains began in 1782, just months after the sinking. Early divers, brave men with primitive gear, descended into the dark waters, their air supplied through leather hoses, their vision limited to flickering lantern light. What they found below was both awe-inspiring and horrifying. The once mighty warship lay on her side, her masts snapped, her cannons scattered like bones, and the decks eerily intact in places, a silent echo of life frozen in time. Reports describe the wreck as a labyrinth of twisted timbers and shadowed corridors. Divers spoke of seeing skeletons still entangled in ropes and hammocks, uniforms decayed, but buttons and medals gleaming faintly in the dim light. Every descent became a descent into history and tragedy. Despite the dangerous conditions, recovery efforts continued. The Royal Navy wanted the guns and valuable materials retrieved. Teams of divers used crude explosives to break open parts of the wreck, a process that often disturbed human remains. Some artifacts were raised: cannonballs, anchors, and even small personal items, pocket watches, combs, pipes, and silverware engraved with initials long forgotten. By the early 1800s, interest in the wreck had turned from recovery to preservation and curiosity. The Royal Engineers, led by Colonel Pasley in 1839, undertook one of the earliest large-scale underwater demolitions to clear the wreckage, which was obstructing the anchorage. They used gunpowder charges, carefully placed and detonated by electric current, a groundbreaking technology at the time. The underwater explosions sent columns of water shooting skyward, shaking the harbor and astonishing onlookers who gathered along the shore to witness the spectacle. These demolitions revealed more of the ship's structure and brought up hundreds of relics. Some were melted down, others preserved in museums. The recovered bronze and iron cannons were displayed as symbols of lost glory, reminders of the risks and valor of naval life. But what moved the public most were the personal remains. Coffins were carved, and long-dead sailors were finally given burials they had been denied for over half a century. Colonel Pasley's work marked the birth of modern underwater engineering. The Royal George had inadvertently become a laboratory for new diving technologies and underwater explosives. The lessons learned at Spithead paved the way for future salvage operations, influencing how humanity interacted with the world beneath the waves. Yet amid the technical triumphs, the wreck itself remained sacred. Local fishermen swore the area was haunted, that strange lights flickered beneath the water on calm nights, and ghostly sounds echoed when the wind blew in from the sea. They said it was the souls of the drowned restless still, guarding their sunken ship. By the late 19th century, the Royal George had largely disappeared into the silt, its timbers rotting away, its story fading from public memory. But in every recovered relic, in every weathered musket or rusted anchor, there lingered the echo of that fateful day, August 29, 1782, when Britain's proudest ship met its tragic end. The recovery efforts, though practical in purpose, had inadvertently done something greater. They had resurrected history itself, giving voice once more to those who had been lost to the deep. The loss of HMS Royal George was more than a naval catastrophe. It was a turning point that reshaped the way Britain viewed its navy, its heroes, and the sea itself. In the aftermath of the tragedy, grief turned into reflection, and reflection into resolve. The ship's story would live on, whispered through generations, told in poems, songs, and the silent roll of the tide at Spithead. For the British Navy, the sinking was a wake-up call. The disaster revealed fatal flaws in naval operations, from the lack of safety drills to the dangerous practice of performing heavy maintenance while fully manned. Never again would a warship be allowed to heel over so recklessly. Regulations were rewritten, procedures tightened, and the Royal George inquiry became a foundational moment in the evolution of naval safety. Out of tragedy came reform, the kind that would eventually save countless lives in centuries to follow. But beyond the naval world, the human dimension of the story resonated even deeper. The ship's crew was not made up solely of hardened sailors and officers. Many of the dead were ordinary people, wives, children, and tradesmen who had come aboard for a brief visit before the ship set sail. Their deaths turned the event into a national mourning, not just a military loss. Churches across Britain held services, bells tolled in unison, and donations poured in to support the families of the victims. The disaster struck such a powerful chord that even poets took up their pens to honor the fallen. William Cowper's elegy, "The Loss of the Royal George," became one of the most famous literary responses to the event. His words painted a haunting picture of the calm before the catastrophe, the suddenness of the end, and the sorrow of a nation that watched its pride vanish beneath the sea. The poem immortalized the moment when Britain's might was humbled, not by an enemy, but by nature and human error. In the port towns along the southern coast, memorials began to appear. Simple plaques, weathered statues, and stone crosses bore the names of those who had perished. Some were mass graves, others marked unknown sailors who had washed ashore days after the sinking. These memorials became sacred places for families who never received the bodies of their loved ones. Every year, people would gather there to lay flowers and whisper prayers to the sea. As time passed, the legend of the Royal George transformed into both a cautionary tale and a symbol of resilience. The name itself, once a mark of naval dominance, now carried the weight of memory and humility. Shipbuilders invoked it as a reminder to respect the ocean, to design with care, and to never underestimate the dangers that lurked beneath calm waters. Even in the Victorian era, when Britain ruled the waves with unmatched naval power, the story of the Royal George remained in textbooks and sailors' lore. Young cadets were taught not just about battles and victories, but about the price of complacency. The Royal George was proof that even the greatest ship, blessed with the name of the king, could meet a sudden and merciless end if pride overshadowed caution. The legacy also lived on through the technological advancements it inspired. The salvage efforts of Colonel Pasley and his team, pioneering electric detonations and diving techniques, would go on to influence underwater demolition, marine archaeology, and salvage operations well into the 20th century. In a sense, the Royal George continued to serve long after it sank by teaching humanity how to explore and respect the world beneath the waves. But perhaps the most powerful legacy was emotional. The people of Britain had seen their pride destroyed, yet they found meaning in remembrance. Songs were sung about sailors lost at sea, and mothers told their children stories of courage amid chaos, of men who refused to abandon their shipmates, of families torn apart, and of the quiet dignity that followed despair. These stories kept the human side of the tragedy alive, ensuring that the Royal George was never just a shipwreck, but a symbol of shared loss and enduring spirit. To this day, the waters of Spithead remain calm, concealing what little is left of the great warship. Beneath the waves, timbers sleep in the silt, and the sea hums softly with the echoes of the past. Divers who have visited the site report an eerie stillness, as if the ocean itself stands guard over the memories of those lost. More than 2 centuries later, the HMS Royal George continues to remind us of a timeless truth: that power, no matter how great, is fragile when tested by the sea. It is a story not of defeat, but of remembrance, of lessons learned through sorrow, and of a nation's enduring bond with its sailors who braved the deep. Over 200 years have passed since the HMS Royal George slipped beneath the waters of Spithead, yet her story still whispers through time, a haunting reminder of how pride, tragedy, and memory intertwine. Though her timbers have long since crumbled into the silt, the legacy of the Royal George lives on, in museums, in maritime history, and in the collective consciousness of a nation shaped by the sea. In the modern world, the Royal George is no longer just a forgotten naval incident. She has become a symbol of Britain's maritime heritage and the hidden cost of naval greatness. Maritime archaeologists and historians continue to study her, not as an artifact of war, but as a human story. The wreck's remains, scattered fragments of wood and iron, tell tales of courage and chaos, of engineering marvels and human error, and of the ordinary lives caught in the unforgiving grasp of fate. In the late 20th century, renewed diving expeditions revisited the site where the ship went down. Sonar imaging and underwater robotics revealed faint traces of her structure, buried deep beneath layers of sediment. Each discovery, no matter how small, a musket, a belt buckle, or a nail, was treated with reverence. The divers described the site as a cathedral of silence, where history sleeps and every ripple feels sacred. These expeditions weren't about treasure, they were about remembrance, connecting the living to those who had vanished in a single, unimaginable moment. Museums across Britain, particularly the National Maritime Museum in Greenwich, house relics and records of the Royal George. Visitors walk through exhibits that feature the ship's recovered cannons, fragments of her hull, and documents detailing the investigation that followed her sinking. Many are moved not by the scale of the ship, but by the faces behind the tragedy: the sailors, the families, the women and children who never returned. Their names, etched into stone memorials, bridge the centuries between the living and the dead. In Portsmouth, near the very waters where the Royal George once lay, memorials stand in quiet dignity. Locals still refer to the spot as the resting place of the proud ship, and every so often flowers appear on the shore, left anonymously perhaps by descendants of those who were lost. The sea may have claimed the ship, but it could never erase her memory from the hearts of those who call the coast their home. Beyond the monuments, the story of the Royal George continues to inspire artists, filmmakers, and writers. In documentaries and historical retellings, her fate serves as both tragedy and metaphor, a reflection on how even the mightiest can fall in a single instant. Modern storytellers often draw parallels between the Royal George and more recent maritime disasters, such as the Titanic or the Estonia, reminding audiences that while technology evolves, human vulnerability before nature remains unchanged. Perhaps the most profound legacy, however, lies in the silent respect that the sea commands. The sinking of the Royal George stands as a cautionary tale about hubris, responsibility, and the unpredictable power of nature. It taught generations of naval officers that the ocean is not a mere battleground or highway of empire. It is a living force that demands humility and respect. The Royal George also holds an enduring place in British cultural memory. Folk songs from the 19th century, like Toll for the Brave, were sung in taverns and on ships across the empire, keeping the story alive. Even today, these songs echo through historical reenactments and sea shanty performances, connecting modern audiences to the heartbreak of 1782. Through melody and verse, the ship that once ruled the waves continues to sail, not across oceans, but through the tides of time. As the 21st century advances, digital technology has breathed new life into the Royal George's tale. 3D recreations and virtual reality simulations now allow people to walk her decks, to stand on the gun ports, and to experience the moment of her final tilt into the sea. These innovations bring history closer than ever, ensuring that new generations will not forget the lessons written in her wreckage. Ultimately, the HMS Royal George endures not because of her grandeur, but because of what she represents: the fragility of human achievement and the resilience of remembrance. Beneath the tranquil waves of Spithead lies more than a sunken ship. There rests a story of ambition, error, sorrow, and honor. A story that reminds us how the sea, though it may claim what is built upon it, never truly silences what is remembered in the human heart.